coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, manager Reftelis and GovLove co-host for today's episode. We've got a great episode for you. We're talking with a friend of the pod and discussing, trends of the last 10 years and also people operations. But before we get into that, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. Engaging Local Government Leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. And somehow we are celebrating 10 years of local government stories here on the podcast. I can't believe it still. I know this is like probably the umpteenth time I've said that on the podcast, but it's still pretty cool that we've been around that long. But as part of our celebration, we're opening up the GovLove hotline to our listeners. So you can call 720-282-1752. Tell us what you think local government might be like in another 10 years and some of the trends or things you've seen impact the profession over the last 10 years. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Alex Lawrence is the Chief People Officer for the city of Boston, Massachusetts, a position she's been in since 2022. In that role, she oversees the Office of Human Resources, the Office of Labor Relations, the Registry, and appropriations for health benefits, unemployment, and workers' compensation. Prior to that, she held roles in the city's Department of Innovation and Technology, and also roles as a consultant in the technology space and in the nonprofit world. And with that, welcome back to GovLove, Alex. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so as you know, one of our traditions on the podcast is to get to know our guests a little better, let you warm up with a lightning round. So my first question for you, what's the first concert that you went to?
The first concert I ever went to was Brandy. 702 opened. I feel like that is maybe aging me a little bit, but if you know, you know.
That's awesome. Very fun. I always love asking, does Brandy still get play in the rotation? Any playlists still feature?
Yeah, I definitely have like a nostalgia music taste. Yeah. I did go to see the Backstreet Boys at the Sphere.
Did you really? Oh my God.
Like a couple weeks ago with my girlfriends from high school. So I think nostalgia music listening to is something I'm pretty into.
Oh, Backstreet Boys at the Sphere. That's gotta be something. I cannot imagine.
It was like me and 20 other moms and it was great.
Yeah. But the whole crowd, I'm sure, was moms and daughters and
no, it was just moms. It was like I was a prototype of the audience. Everyone was me. Just anyway.
Perfect. Oh my gosh, I love that. All right, the next lightning round question for you. What book are you currently reading?
Yeah, so I have like no non-embarrassing answer to this question. I tend to read I have an incredibly crazy job. I am a mother of two. So reading is a bit of my escape. So I read thrillers generally as like the way that I escape. I'm currently reading The Woman in Cabin 10 by Ruth Ware. If anyone is interested in thrillers, I keep a notes app and my star ratings of them, and I'm happy to share.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you might have to share because this is with our second child is 9 months. And so I have yet to recover my my reading habit. And maybe a part of that is like I need to find something that a little more grabbing and
this is the way I get reading in because like I cannot read something that works my brain. It has to be escapism for me at this point in my career. I hope to get to another point where I like read, interesting fiction or things about the world, but I'm not there.
Yeah. Every time I pick up a book like that, I'm like, I don't know that I have the bandwidth for this right now, but a thriller. Oh, or a mystery. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Last lightning question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
This is such a hard, I don't know. I found this an intimidating question because I think I don't spend probably enough time intentionally thinking about that. But I think that in local government, finding inspiration is like walking around your city and living your life.
Yeah.
It's like what it feels like right now, taking my kids to school through a snowstorm when the bus isn't running. And I know that our city workers are doing like literally everything they possibly can and working crazy overtime to make the city function better in a time that's really, really hard. So for those of you who don't know, in Boston right now, we got the biggest storm in one of the 10th biggest storm in history in modern measurement, and then followed by just unprecedented cold and freezing. So we have a combo of just like a dumping of snow, and then instead of typically what happens after a storm where the snow has the ability to melt, there is no ability to melt. We are in sub-zero temperatures. So it's just, I think walking around the street and seeing how hard everyone is working and people's neighbors are working to snow out their car. And, there's the occasional neighborhood fight that you see. But I think times like this, where there's just an extreme thing that is happening from the outside, I take inspiration in just watching people realize that like getting around the city is a collective challenge that we all have to work together to complete.
Yeah, no, that's well said. Seeing people, it doesn't have to be an emergency event, but even just like seeing people come together for like a community event or an engagement thing, it's always, I agree with you. That always gives me inspiration. And it's beautiful to see. So 10th biggest storm, how many inches of snow did that end up being?
So, like 19.
Oh my gosh.
And it like dumped really fast. And it was crazy. And so school was canceled for 2 days. And, my kids had a ton of fun, but from a logistical standpoint, it's a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah. For our listeners, we had to reschedule because you saw this coming and we're like, I'm going to be at home with children on a snow day. This will be,
while working to figure out how everyone is going to report to work and communicate to the entire workforce about when their shift starts and when their snow compensation time starts. And it was not a time that I could take to do a podcast.
That's the other thing is like, as a local government staffer, like the beauty of a snow day is like no longer applies to you because you're like, I gotta figure out how people are gonna get to work and like clear roads and like pick up trash. Despite these conditions, it's not just like let's go find a hill and sled down it.
Yeah, my kids got to hang out with neighbors and who I'm very, very grateful for, and go sledding I'm sure they had fun to figure out other things. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, today we'll talk more kind of about your work and what's going on at the city of Austin. But this is an interview I'm doing as part of a series where I'm reflecting on 10 years of GovLove and asking some of our, favorite guests to come back and chat again. And one of the things I've been starting these conversations with is, local government has changed a lot in that time, and I want to get your perspective on what you think some of the biggest changes are that you've seen at the city or at the organizations you've dealt with. And then what you kind of see them still dealing with. So like, what are some of those takeaways for you over the last 10 years and kind of how the profession's changed or the work of local government might have changed?
Yeah. So it's such an interesting question, I think, specifically in the government workforce space. I think in the last podcast time, I was really sort of developing the theory that coming out of COVID, it became just so obvious that we needed to, as a sort of industry, deal with our workforce challenges. And I still think that theory proved very true and that there's still a ton of work to do in this space. I think things like procurement and government technology, those are, I started in civic tech right before healthcare.gov failed. And now you have these very strong, robust ecosystems and organizations that are devoted to solving the problems of civic technology. I think procurement sort of saw a slight wave after that. And you have these amazing organizations out there, thinking about how to solve challenges in the government procurement space. I think the government talent space is an ecosystem that is still developing. The nonprofits are still growing. I want to shout out Work for America, who's doing amazing work in this space, and I think getting a lot of traction. But I do think that sort of developing, and there are folks at the Kennedy School and professors like Elizabeth Linos who are now studying this space in ways that are really helpful. But it still just feels a little bit like I'm doing this work a tiny bit as a pioneer. That is what both of those organizations have told me. And I'm just like, what? Like, I'm not a pioneer. I'm just like doing normal organizational work. But I do think in this weird way, we are a little bit at the vanguard in thinking about workforce challenges at the local level. Like there isn't a robust sort of set of well-defined best practices that are clear and obvious and long-term tested. And I think part of that happened as a result of COVID and how COVID changed things. I also think, and happy to sort of dig into that and talk about how I think COVID just sort of of brought to bear, everybody, there was the great resignation, like people saw
Yeah.
this across all different sectors about
Hmm.
why investing in your workforce and workplace culture matters. But I think like government, usually, we're not cutting edge, so it takes us a little longer for good reason.
Yeah.
Or we're not bleeding edge, I should say. We can do
Hmm.
really innovative things, but there's a reason you want government to be stable. And so you don't always want it to be the place where you're trying something totally brand new. You want it, there's a good reason why you do things that are a little bit more tested.
Yeah.
And so I think that is something that we've really been thinking a lot about in the government workforce space. And then I also think that you had a set of both through what happened in COVID, and then I also think just like as particularly baby boomers aged, there were a
Hmm.
lot of retirements that
Yeah.
happened around the same time. And I think every time a person who is like an institution who holds a place together in glue, tape, and scissors, and everyone knows
Yes.
who that is in their organization, right? Like those people who just by force of will and personality and sheer talent and passion for the work just like hold so much. And I think
Hmm.
you saw, and I don't think this is a Boston unique thing. I've talked to other people at other local governments. A lot of those people left the workforce at a similar time.
Yeah.
Again, because of reasons like COVID, they're like, I just can't do this anymore, or just because again the way that the workforce aged. And in government, local government, we're always doing things that are super lean. I always joke that like
Hmm.
what I do, I balance on my pinky. Liberty Mutual, no knock to them, amazing, well-resourced organization, has 14 people who are like thinking about how they
Yeah.
might do a thing, right?
Exactly.
And I'm just
Yeah.
like, oh, I like took one meeting about this once, but like I forgot to follow up because I just didn't, like I don't have the capacity. And so all this to say, we don't spend a ton of time, I think we were going to talk about this later, but like being able to invest in things like succession planning and things
Yeah.
like documenting how work happens. I mean, though it's not because we don't know those things are important. Of course we do. We
Hmm.
simply just can't prioritize it over the like deluge of things that are coming across our desk just to keep up with the world, and let alone new policy ideas. Like there's just so much to do. And
Yeah.
so it's not like, oh, nobody's thought of, oh, succession planning is important. Of course we have, but it's just really fundamentally practically a challenging thing to focus on. And so I think that being able to gear up for those challenges and build institutional ways of
Mm.
dealing with like what happens when that institution leaves, like of a person leaves
Yeah.
their job, is I think just a frankly huge challenge that we're not a particularly mature local government is not a particularly mature set of organizations, well structured to deliver and think about those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on because it's funny that I'm a consultant and I work with local governments all across the country, and anytime we do a project and we engage with staff, like there is that person in a department who's been there, sometimes it's 10, 30, 40, 50 years, that you're right, or it's kind of holding it all together through sheer force of will, or they're doing the jobs of three people instead of one or more sometimes. And it's not so much that like um that that you wouldn't ever be able to find the people to do that work. It's just that you're not going to find that specific person that can do all of those three unique things in this environment and know all the right people to talk to. You can't replace that one to one. And so you might have to get 2-3 FTEs or new hires to replace the work that they're leaving behind. But I think you're totally right. Like that is such a challenge for organizations like that. That is and it's hard to like document or even quantify because you can't. It's hard to even say this is we think this is the person that might apply to, but until you kind of really dig into the work that they're doing that's outside of their job description, like you're totally right. Like that, figuring out how to replace that is a challenge.
Yeah.
And I want to come back to the COVID thing you said, but you're right. The other piece that is interesting is that you said there, you feel like you're at the vanguard of some of this like workforce stuff, even 10 years, I think in the 10-year horizon, the the silver tsunami has been a buzzword that whole time,
Yeah.
but it seemed like it finally did come to pass. And so I don't know if like in that time period, at some point we were like, there's the boy who cried wolf. And so we stopped preparing for it. But it seems like it is actually, has occurred, is occurring in organizations. And you're seeing those retirements of some of those, people that you talked about, or just kind of your everyday positions that are decided it's time. So I'm curious. Yeah, what do you think of that kind of phase? Like it does seem like it's actually come to pass, which maybe it, for a long time, millennials were told it was going to, and it never really did.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting. And I mean, I think I see the impacts of it every day. And I think those are the kinds of things where you think somebody's going to leave and then things are going to fall apart. And that's never how it goes.
Yeah.
It actually takes years to feel the impact of those kinds of things, because they are like the things they would catch are these like small details or things they just sort of knew how to do. It was so interesting when our head of basic city services was talking about this snowstorm. He specifically said, like, because massive storms are a thing that have a much longer time horizon, they only happen every, knock on wood, knock on all the wood.
Yeah.
These snow seasons happen in cycles. So it had been a few years, 4 years since we had like a real major storm. And he was like, it's actually like there's a bunch of new people doing this that haven't done this specific thing before. Also just because of like the way the city changed. The part of the city where a lot of the snow farms used to be sort of industrial wasteland. It now has buildings on it. So we can't put the snow there. And so just sort of like the passage of time means, and when these things have like longer cycle horizons, it's like all of a sudden you go to do the thing and you realize like, okay, it's a different crew, it's different people. Don't get me wrong. They're all doing an amazing job out there. We are like it's just sort of like you're a little rusty, and the crew is a little different, and the people leading it haven't necessarily experienced this exact same thing, and so they can't pull from the same experience. So and I think this happens too with like it's like payroll things or again, we're still making payroll. It's fine. Like these are not crises. They're just these sort of like little things that a person might catch that you now have to just put in more controls into place because it's just not a person who like knows exactly how this thing works because they built it.
Yeah. Yeah. Or how to handle that one exception that occurs, with every 3 to 5
only
years.
When you write a new union contract that only has this one kind of thing,
Yeah. And you're right. Because it's the people that have been there that long time have those, like, they've done it, over the course of their career, but like you got to be able to write those things down at some point to be able to capture it. But so I do
find that paper where it was written on.
Yeah, exactly. Or the sticky note. Yeah. I do want to go back to COVID, because you're right. It is kind of this huge like turning point, especially for workforce, I would imagine, over this kind of like, couple of 10 years of like how the kind of profession has changed. So like, what can you maybe talk a little more about how you've seen, the work of, people operations, or the work of workforce, like development and management? Like how is that impacted by the pandemic, and maybe how is it still being impacted by some of the things coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah. So I think there were, a couple of realizations, and I should have listened to my episode so that I don't say the same thing the same thing that I said last time. But I think that, I talked about the fact that I had restructured the people operations cabinet and like launched a new cabinet. And I often joke that like the organizational change around doing that was easier than the time I moved the timesheets from the first floor to the 7th floor, because it was that obvious of a thing that everybody agreed needed to happen. Yeah. I think that like everyone saw that through COVID, we needed to focus on the workforce, and that our workers like needed to have a seat at the table in how policies worked. Like that is just a thing COVID did. I think it also just fundamentally helped people see that like we could do work differently, and we could do work more flexibly in a way that, a sentence I say a lot of the time is like, if you treat people like adults, they'll act like adults. And you need to have guardrails, don't get me wrong, but like those things can be the guardrails and be the exception. And your policies can lead with the fact that human beings largely are responsible, that employees largely want to come in and do their work. And if you approach policy and communications assuming good intent from everyone and then put parameters that govern those edge cases when people don't behave that way. I think COVID taught us that that could happen for the most part. Things like you had to do things radically different, and people, there were lots of things that were horrible, but for government still existed, and it still delivered services, and it delivered services in ways that people couldn't even imagine, right? People whose job it was, I'll never forget, to be the assistant for the head of the planning department was in charge of PPE, right? And did an amazing job. And so you sort of saw that if you give people challenges, they will rise to the occasion. And these structures that we use that again govern for the edge cases of an occasional bad actor don't have to be how we lead. I think that I really took from that, and people are going to rise to the occasion if you give them the opportunity. And so I think that's really the mission of our cabinet, is to give people that guidance and structure on what good looks like and and give them that opportunity to be empowered and come in here and do a good job. And again, I always want to say that with a caveat, we have public service is a privilege, and taxpayers pay our salaries, and it's incredibly important that our employees continue to instill public trust, and we do need guidelines and parameters for when they break that trust, that they're able to be held accountable, and discipline is real, and I believe in it, and all of those things. I just don't see them as fundamentally incompatible with in any way with writing policies that lead with good intent and assume people are here to do their jobs.
Yeah. No, I love that sentiment. And you're, so I'm curious though, and maybe it is a little bit on the policies thing that you touched on there. Because it's one thing to ask someone to kind of rise to the occasion and, a world pandemic that it hasn't happened in 100 years. It's another to be how do you make this, a part of the institution or a part of the day-to-day of how we kind of do our work? So how do you think about that in terms of we want people to do more or rise to the occasion, but there's not a world changing event that is forcing us to do that. So how does that kind of get, I don't know, or how are you thinking about implementing that into the practices of the organization?
Great. So I think this was a really interesting example of how you can change specifically bargaining with unions. So we have an incredibly complex collective bargaining environment in the city of Boston. Across the entire organization, we have 38 different units. And so if you're changing workplace conditions, rewriting a policy, there's a lot of cooks, a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and
with strong opinions,
with strong opinions, and who represent completely different aims. And that's important, and that's their job, right? That doesn't mean they're doing it wrong. It means they're doing it right. But what the firefighters want, and what the teachers want, and what a person who sits at a desk wants, and what a person who sweeps the streets wants, those are going to be different things. And that's why they're represented by different people who represent their interests. And so that can mean making changes that impact everyone can be pretty hard. Again, for good reason, with well-intentioned people reflecting a diversity of opinions. So I think that the way that we implemented a hybrid policy coming out of COVID is a really good example of how we can do that. The city had no telework policy of any kind prior to COVID. People got sent home. A lot of people worked from their computers. I think the world changed in terms of how they viewed hybrid work. You now sort of see that sometimes swinging back the other way, with people feeling downtowns need people sitting in downtowns. It becomes a thing that is a practical issue, but people have a lot of feelings about it. There's also a lot of feelings that people who have valid feelings that, some people get to sit and do their laundry, and other people have to come into an office building. You can't shovel snow from your from your couch. And so, I think, but also flexibility is important, and different jobs have different, are different. And so how do you take things that sort of balance all of those complex different interests into play? And so what we did specifically with our hybrid policy is, rather than being here's what we want the policy to be, unions, here's the policy, tell us things you like or don't like, and then we're going to implement it. We thought about it a little differently. We thought, what if we did a pilot policy that explicitly wrote in that it was a pilot? We're going to write this policy for 6 months. We're going to implement it for 6 months. And at that time, towards the end of those 6 months, we're going to do a survey for managers and employees about what's working about this and what's not working about this. And we're going to take those and incorporate those changes into the policy before we make it live. So like, if you're worried about this, you can tell us your worries up front, but like, let's not get too worried about that. If this doesn't work and managers and employees don't like it, or there's serious problems, it'll just go away, and we'll write that into this negotiation. And then likewise, we're giving flexibility to a certain subset of workers. So if you're in a collective bargaining unit where this kind of flexibility doesn't apply to you, are there things where you think in other policies you could have more flexibility? And so that was a really helpful way that like sort of expanded the pie of what was possible and got rid of some of the institutional sort of resistance to doing work like this. So we implemented the policy for the largely it was successful. It was a small population, right? Like, people still came in the building. A lot of people still came in the building and ate lunch in downtown. And it's like a pretty small fraction of the workforce that takes it. But for jobs like in the technology space, it's really important for us to have that flexibility, because any other location where they're going to take a job, they're going to have that flexibility. And so for the specific jobs where it was relevant, it went pretty well. There were a couple of tweaks that we needed to make the policy about, like how people could file their changes in reporting changes in which day they worked. A couple of places where managers wanted a little bit more discretion if they felt like they couldn't make sure that somebody was still getting their work done. So we made a few tweaks according to that. We also talked to, for example, our inspectors union and they came to us and said, hey, we'd like to not have to check in person at the end of every day. That was a kind of example of flexibility that they felt COVID showed. Like, they didn't actually have to just come in and check every day. Like, they could check in the mornings, but the end of the day check-in just wasn't required. And so again, sort of getting back to the intent and the feelings and not doing it all at once allowed us to get this thing that like had sort of been a thing that everyone kind of felt like we were never going to be able to get done, and formalized in a way that I think for the most part worked for everyone. I know there are some people who still don't love it as a policy, but I think it allows us to use what do you say, like a scalpel instead of a hatchet.
Yeah. Well, and I love that. I love the idea of a pilot policy, because I imagine a lot of the pushback, especially in a heavily union environment, you get when you want to update a policy is that like, this will, be the thing and there's no, changing it. But going into a change with like, hey, we're going to test this. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And if it does, we can implement it or not. And like that kind of takes the pressure off too, I would imagine, if some of those like policy updates.
Totally. And I actually think that it's like, I have this weird background where I came from the civic technology space into the people operations space, but I actually take a lot from that, which is like when you don't have to do a big giant thing that changes things forever, but you can do a little thing and then get input on it, like it produces better outcomes. That's why Agile exists. Like that's why like people in the technology space have learned that this is a method that produces better outcomes. So like, why couldn't we approach policy making in that same way? I think we can. Not in every context, but when we can, we should do it.
Yeah. Well, and actually I was going to ask this later, but it kind of makes sense in the sweep of kind of reflecting on 10 years too. Like when I was prepping for this, I saw that you started as an intern in the Office of New Urban Mechanics. And obviously you worked in IT doing some of this human-centered design stuff as well. But like, that was like one of the first like innovation groups in the country in local government. Yeah. And I'm just curious, like how you think, I mean, you already touched on it a little bit, but like how you think that's impacted your career and like, and kind of your approach to public service, like, cause like that was one of the early ones. And like, it's had these like, alumni that are out all over the profession now. And I'm sure all across the city too.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that first of all, the fact that I'm here is because of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. Like, I think really early on, one of the goals of MONUM was to be a talent development shop. And that I think has been a big piece of its legacy. They posted a fellowship. And when I was at the Kennedy School, I didn't know what I wanted to do next when I graduated. I didn't even know what I wanted to do for the summer. And I saw a cool job posting and it sounded interesting. And I knew I, cared deeply about my city. And I knew I cared about access to resources and public service. And so I was just like, sure. Like I had my early career was all was in the nonprofit space. Mm-hmm. And so, they for the main answer is like it got me here.
Yeah.
I got to see local government from the inside, fell in love with it, and thought, wow, there's like no place I think I could have a greater impact on serving my own community. I totally got the local government bug from that summer fellowship. And then and so I think that's had a huge influence. And then I think sort of like thinking about how can government take on risk, how can we do things differently, all of that, how do we pilot before we scale, all of that deeply comes from the Monum ethos. That's Mayor's Office of Urban Mechanics. Monum is often what it's known. I think it's been really interesting to also just, if the theme of this is like reflecting on the passage of time, it's funny. I often joke like, start as an innovator, live long enough to become the crusty bureaucrat.
Yeah.
It's like a little bit of what it feels like is sometimes my arc. And I mean that in the best way possible, like truly in love. I actually affectionately love referring to myself as a crusty bureaucrat. I see it as a compliment because I'm like valuing the concept of like what government is here to protect, like genuinely.
Yeah.
But I think I say this to mean that we don't, like in this particular administration with our, I think Michelle Wu, a mayor who's also a brilliant innovator who thinks about like imagining the possibilities for Boston and thinks differently, is sort of like, what does innovation mean in a government where everyone is innovating? It's a really interesting set of questions. And so I think it means that we really need to have a balance between those who are trying to think differently about what we're trying to do and also be like, okay, but we still got to deliver and we have to still deliver all of the basic things and not, just because it's new doesn't mean it's new and shiny doesn't mean it's good or that it's a good idea. And like, we still we've got to still, get the small things right to do the big things. And so I think that it's just been a really interesting question of like, I think we see it around us all the time, sort of like, I think we've evolved from like Monum is the place where like the new ideas has to happen to like innovation can mean how do we like we're in this much more mature place of scale. How do we actually bring these new ideas and embed them in our operations? How do we create a culture of continuous improvement where everyone sees it's their job to like take their piece of the puzzle and like make that thing better? It actually feels like this, like, people are like, wait, is it relevant anymore? It's like, no, it's the most relevant because it's like, it's actually just the air we breathe. Like that's what being successful looks like, is like people just take it for granted that this is how government can operate.
Yeah, no, that I love that. That's a lovely sentiment because you're right. Like I would imagine early on and back then with the office that like, it was, you were the outcast maybe, or, you were the people trying to do things a new way. And when that like culture spreads through a whole organization, all of a sudden it's kind of it is the norm. And like, and that's good. Like that, I mean, that has that's the impact that those kind of offices we're trying to have, in organizations. So like, that's really inspiring.
Right. And so I think people, like I just say, for listeners who are interested in government innovation, like I'd say that like, I think we're at a place of sort of maturity, and maybe Boston is like a privileged position, but like where if you want to innovate in government, you don't just have to look at the jobs in the innovation teams. Like you can do that in any job in government. And so like, I hope we're at the place where that is true across a lot of different local governments, where like you're going to find lots of people who want to do these things differently. And it's really about the approach, like coming in and being a critical listener and understanding, what came before you, and understanding like, what are the rules, what are the goals, and how are you going to do what's in between those two things? Yeah.
And it's expected more, I would say, of positions where like, hey, you're going to come in and be a leader, and we also expect you to know, at least have awareness of some of these innovation principles so that you can help us from every role. Yeah, that's a great point. So that, you touched on this a little bit, but I do want to kind of maybe talk about it some more in more detail. But we mentioned like how the last time you were on, the people operations cabinet was sort of a new restructuring. And I know when you talked with GovLove last, you talked about some of the big structural changes that were maybe opportunities for you guys to tackle in this new kind of role, or this new structure. But I just wanted to kind of ask you to reflect on what are some of those, how have some of those big changes gone? Are there still things that, that I'm sure there are still things on your list, but are there things that you thought maybe,
no, I fixed it all. It's perfect now.
But are there things they thought, hey, maybe we can knock this out, and now it's turned into a much larger engagement? Or like, how have some of those,
Yeah.
hey, you had this big dream as a new restructured cabinet, like how has it gone in the time since?
Yeah. So I think a couple of reflections on this. I think the first thing I'll say is like, I think how we do the work sometimes matters so much more than what
Yeah.
we're doing. So
Mm.
I would say that most of the changes we've made really have to do with the how we get it done, because I think that's what sort of like wins hearts and minds and makes people
Mm.
feel like the change sticks, much more than like what is the specific policy we rewrote or
Yeah.
like what is the project that we took on. um, I think that some of the stuff that I'm most proud of, and it's because I have brought on some like, or worked with some really amazing professionals, some of whom we've brought on, some of whom were here before. I don't want to say these are just new people that we brought on, but we've done a bunch of work, I think, really just improving the employee relations and training functions of our
Mm.
organization.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like early on, I was one myself, but I talked to managers who had been here for 17 years and had barely received any management training. We had
Mm.
like sort of one program that was, you know, a perfectly good program for what it was resourced to be. But like, people had been here for years and barely knew where our policies were, what they
Yeah.
are, and how they're supposed to access them, or even how to think of them. But also just like had barely had any management training or support of any kind. And
Mm.
so we were able to launch some really great programs that don't reach nearly as enough people, and don't have nearly the amount of resources I wish and envision for them. But the feedback we've gotten from those has been truly amazing. I mean, people, like, the feedback we get is like, I needed this 17 years ago and I just want more of it.
Yeah.
And that's, some of it is specific manager training and training on our context. Training on our policies, but some of it is also just like, how do I think about this work? Like, how does public records law intersect with my
Yeah.
work? Like, what does a strong mayor system and city council, and how does that impact what we're able to get done? A lot of the time we just sort of assume that people come here and they know how government works. And even if folks are extremely downstream from some of these other things, like I say, it's not political to say that the fact that we're a political institution impacts
Yeah.
everybody.
Mm-hmm.
That's how our rules are made. And so everybody kind of needs to understand that it's not about who are you going to vote for, but it still like impacts the way the work happens.
Yeah.
So that's one piece of it. I think just another piece on the more like employee relations side is, I think we were like really behind on being able to respond to organizational complaints. And like, when people
Mm.
feel like these processes, like something happens in the workplace that shouldn't have happened, and that it takes them years to get back any sort of like resolution or action, that sort of thing can really degrade a culture over time. So
Mm.
having the resources
Yeah.
to just be responsive when things happen, because conflict is going to happen in the workplace,
Yeah.
right? Like, people are always like, we shouldn't advertise how many complaints we got. Those statistics are going to make us look bad, or like a toxic work environment. It's like, okay, but like, find me a workplace where conflict doesn't happen. Like,
Yeah.
that is just a workplace that is acting like conflict doesn't happen, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
not like,
Mm-hmm.
humans are going to human.
Yeah.
And so, but I think being responsive to those things is super important. I think another sort of like on the like smaller scale, but it actually took a lot of work to get here, thing that I'm so proud of is our like communications
Yeah.
arm. And I know that was a thing you were planning on asking about, but
Yeah.
like being able to write emails that translate complex policy into plain language. I think a moment that happened, and I'm obviously focused on sort of like this snow week that happened that made me like the most proud I think I've been, was actually a email that came from one of our unions to their members. And it was about this email that we wrote explaining to people how to use their time based on when the snow emergency was called and how they were supposed to report to work, right? It's the email I wrote instead of doing the podcast on the day I was supposed to do the podcast with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we did it in collaboration with not just the folks who were planning for the snow removal, but with our labor relations folks, with our HR folks, and with our internal comms team, who are just so good at figuring out how you translate complicated rules into emails that people can read, and
Yeah.
getting those out in a timely way. Like, it makes such a difference. It saves us from actual liability in the form of grievances. But to go back to this email that we received from one of our union partners, they were just like, please see this timely and clearly written communication from the chief people officer. Like,
Yeah.
you should read how well you can, like, your expectations are super clear in this email. Now everyone knows what they are. And so we're not going to have conflict later that we disagreed about it. Everybody knows when, like, what they're going to anticipate in their paychecks, and those, getting those sorts of things right in a timely way, like, truly, like, that restores employees' faith that the institution is there to look after them. And like, and those kind of details, just they matter so much more, I think, than, like, bringing in a massage chair bad, or having cereal on the walls, or I don't know. I can tell I don't work in a startup. I don't know if those are real things that people do. They probably, like, people are probably listening to me being like, of course my workplace has those things. They sound good to me, but I've worked in local government too long. But my point here is, like, I think that's fundamentally, people come in government and they don't expect those kinds of bonuses. They don't expect a ping pong table in their lounge. But, like,
exactly.
They expect to be treated like a human. They expect to be paid when they work in, like, in compliance with their contract. And they expect to have clear communication set. So, sometimes it's really not those big structural things. It's just sort of like how we are doing this work. And I think our biggest project that we've taken on, that of course takes longer than we thought we were, is replacing our talent acquisition management system.
Oh my gosh, HRIS.
So it's not our whole HRIS. No, I mean, just the part where that applicants are interacting with, as well as our onboarding technology. And I think that it's both the what, and I don't want to take success for this project yet because it's not live. And so I'm going to also knock on wood and not
don't jinx it.
Not jinx any of it. But I think our approach has really comes from this sort of, like, human-centered design ethos, again, that I sort of learned from brilliant folks in the technology space, where we did a bunch of, like, we did two different kinds of user research. One, where we worked with a couple of our biggest and most unique departments. So, police hiring is totally different than hiring in the property management context, is totally different than hiring in the HR context. And so, like, we have to build something that works for all of those use cases. So we did a bunch of deep user research with our departments early on to be like, what works about your system today? What doesn't work? And that's helped us be a lot more flexible in how we can think about the requirements of a project. And then we've also done a bunch of user research. We partnered with Bloomworks, an amazing civic technology company, to help us do user research with potential applicants, as well as new hires, to hear what went well, what are the expectations when they apply for a job, and also, what we could do better once they were hired and onboarded. And we're really using all of that feedback, not just, meeting with the internal stakeholders and be like, what is your process? But talking to some of those voices that are often missing from these processes, which are the people it impacts, because otherwise you're just gathering business requirements from people who know the way you currently do it.
Or the people that successfully made it through that process.
Or the people, like you said, who navigated whatever the hell that was. And so, so getting at those people who didn't make it through and thinking about that has been super, super valuable. So, we'll see how that actually relates to the impact of the project fundamentally. But, people are always asking me, like, what platform are you using and is it good? And I'm like, no offense to any particular company that does this work. I'm sure some are better than others, but I think that how you do the project, who you talk to, and how you get that work done is a million times more important than what platform you choose.
Yeah, no, well said. Yeah. And the importance, throughout what you're just talked about, like, of process over, what the particular outcome is. Like, I just want to underline that, like, that I'm sure you could replicate that in every organization, that, like, that how you actually go about doing something is more important than, like, the ultimate outcome, because, it, especially from an HR context, how you engage your staff, how you communicate it, like, that all adds up to, like, how an organization feels about a change or feels about the ultimate, thing that gets decided.
Yeah.
So you're right. I do want to come back to comms, but there was one thing I said that you said that I just wanted to, like, emphasize, and I'm sure you can maybe relate to, is like organizations have such long memories. And so leaving those like unresolved conflicts or like things that HR like addressed but never followed up on, or, maybe they addressed it with the employee, but they never communicated back that like, this conflict was addressed in what way. It's amazing, when you go to organizations and they're like, there's something that happened 10, 15 years ago that staff who weren't even there at the time, so like still know is the lore. And so like being able to like be, transparent and proactive about like, hey, this is, as much as you can, like talk about like, this is how we addressed it. And this is what the result was. Like, I can't imagine that the impact that's going to have over time.
It's funny that you bring that up. So I always would. So I started when I started my career at the city. I started working on permitting stuff, and there is a building that most of the folks in our inspectional services department work out of. It's a building in a place called 1010 Mass Ave. It's several miles from City Hall. It's not located in the central downtown. That gives it a bunch of advantages. People can park there, et cetera. But it's pretty disparate from City Hall, and that can be a pretty big cultural gap, right? Like people who actually work out of City Hall versus people who work at a different building. And every time when I started at inspectional services, I would ask people sort of like about a thing that was going on. It always started in 1986. The inspectional services division moved to 1010 Mass Ave. And I would never follow up with, oh, I was born in 1986. They didn't think anyone would appreciate that. No, people don't love that. But I'm saying it now because that now sounds less young than it did then, although probably, might sound still young to some people and old to others. But, in 1986, 39 years ago, they moved to that building. And you could tell it didn't matter if you were there at the time, but that sort of decision to move them physically to this disparate location still just so deeply impacted the ethos and how people felt and how people it underlined how they saw every decision as like City Hall is a them and we are an us and they view us as a them. And, it didn't matter what you were doing, that cultural feeling still impacted how the work happened. And so like, if you're making change in an organization, whether it's changing a policy or communicating a thing, like those are very real feelings and they still exist. And like, you can ignore them at your own peril.
Yeah, exactly. Well, then, so to come back to communication, so you mentioned, and I think you've emphasized kind of the importance of it, but maybe like practically or kind of in nuts and bolts wise, like how do you guys kind of approach that in terms of like, what are the resources you're throwing at like internal comms as an HR department? Like how do you guys think about like, communicating some of the like more technical stuff that HR has to get out? And then like, I'm like, what does that look like maybe on a more practical level in terms of how you guys approach it?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, we have a person, like we have two people whose jobs are largely communications in our HR department. I think that's probably pretty unique. But it's amazing what like one talented person with Canva and being a really good writer. And like, frankly, sometimes it's like actually helpful that they don't know a lot about HR policy because it's like, sometimes if you know a thing too well, it's like too difficult to communicate about it because you're like, the leave buyback, it happens when the blah, blah, blah. I honestly barely still understand leave buyback. Sick leave buyback, it's like a thing that confuses me. I don't know. It just doesn't fit with my brain. But like, there are these like, sick leave donations or just like these different structural things that are built into our contracts that can be like, either it's a concept that you fully understand and you understand how it impacts you, or especially if you're new to the workforce, like understanding your retirement plan and like, what does that even mean? And like, why do I care about it? Those are things that can be pretty foreign to people. And I think it's like, it may not be our job to explain it to people, like you could view it that way, but I certainly think that it is. Like if we put that onus on people, you could say it's their responsibility to understand it, but we're going to deal with the impacts of them not having understood it. So therefore it might as well be our problem. And so I think just tactically, first of all, it is resourcing it. It is thinking about how every communication that you write is going to a pretty broad, wide audience. Simple things, and none of these are my ideas. They're all things I learned from other people. But when we launched Boston.gov, our brilliant chief digital officer, Lauren Lockwood at the time, and working with IDEO, they made the decision that everything should be below an 8th grade reading level. And they use an app a free online app called the Hemingway app and like put the text in, and that will tell you what the reading level is. And like when you have a policy that was written largely by lawyers and you put it in the Hemingway app, you are not going to find an 8th grade reading level.
No.
And I love my lawyers. To be very clear, they do an amazing job and they are protecting very important things when they write legalese. But like, if people can't understand them, then like, it's probably not actually super protecting us against the liability, or it might be, but it's not helping people understand. And so like, I feel like there's almost always a way where you can say the same thing and protect that same thing that your lawyer cares about while writing in words that humans can understand. And so that has been, that has been a huge piece of the sort of like content creation movement in the digital space. And I think it should 100% like is just as it's important for all municipal services. It's important for language access and translation. And it's certainly important for policies that are going to apply to people with vastly different education levels and backgrounds.
Yeah. That's a great point, because like you're having to communicate with the people that are on the back of a solid waste truck, but also our accountants in the finance office. So like you have a huge range of folks that you have to communicate the same, often sometimes the same policies to, and so being able to speak to everybody is important. And you're right that, or I like the perspective that like maybe having a comms person that doesn't know HR is better.
I think that there is so much room for generalists, and that honestly, that I think that sometimes you actually need a person who doesn't perfectly understand a thing to be like, they have to have the capability of understanding it, but not knowing it from the outset is sometimes a feature and not a bug.
Yeah. Well said. All right. The only other thing I wanted to touch on, just because I know it came up in the last time you were on GovLove, and it's something I see, HR departments dealing with all over the country. But how are you guys kind of thinking? And you may have mentioned this already a little bit, but how are you guys thinking about succession planning? Is that and like how have you guys kind of approached that in the city?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could tell you that we've done like a great job
solved it.
having a big strategy for it. But I think that just being focused on documentation and on training and thinking about it, and every time that we fill a job, like who can do this job and who's the next person who can do this job, and just asking departments to think in that way all the time is so important, right? Like we can't just be finding a person who can do this today. We need to be finding a person who can do this tomorrow. And I think that just, it's like embedded in so many decisions that we make. And like, I think that it to go back to sort of like the overall high level trends thing here, it's not just the silver tsunami, it's a change in how people approach jobs. I think that like different generations often don't see the younger generation does not see, I want to go do a job and I'm going to do that thing for the rest of my career. That just tends to not be how people view work anymore. And
it's
so
also
like
not how institutions treat new employees,
Sure, exactly. And so like people have to be realistic and realize that sort of like idea that people are going to come here and stay forever, but like everything is baked into not doing it that way, right? Like the state, like we participate in the state pension program. You don't vest for 10 years. You don't like, there are these big, like changing the fact that people are going to come in and out is like a very long-term structural change. And so I think it's just, it is so simple, but it's just like working on having standard templates of how you write things down and how you write processes down. And we had an amazing woman who was an institution in our organization. One of these people I was saying, retire recently, Jackie. She was the greatest, and she was our director. She's still alive. She just recently retired, but director of shared services. But basically, like the person whose job it is to make sure that everybody's job record is 100% accurate. And when we have a new collective bargaining agreement passed, or we make a change in how people are compensated, making sure the system does that thing. And so like so much of that is institutional knowledge. It's like when you have this, like our complicated contracts and payroll as complicated as us, like so much of that is institutional knowledge. And so, we knew we had a few years left of Jackie and spent, a bunch of time both creating a deputy position in that role so that she could spend, like, as she was doing all of her work, training the next person to do that work. And also just having a bunch of like it couldn't be just on her to write it down.
Yeah.
And so bringing other people to shadow her, create documentation and duplication was something we were, probably not as intentional as we could be, but certainly more intentional, like super intentional about it to the degree that we could be, because everybody, that day is going to come for everybody.
Yeah.
And so just being super practical about it is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also like your point about like pushing this onto departments to think about too. So it's not just something that HR owns, but it's changing that mindset of like, how do we prepare for the future and prepare, who can do this now and who do we need to start thinking about, down the line too. So it's not just HR's job to think through.
Yeah.
All right. So before we wrap up, what's next? What are you working on that our listeners ought to look out for, or any other kind of big structural things that you're trying to tackle?
Yeah. So it's funny. I realized that this entire time I took on the elections department since the last talk. That is now under our purview, and didn't talk about that at all. And that's taken up a lot of our bandwidth, just making sure that our elections processes are resilient and redundant and also well documented. Another thing that is a challenge across all local governments and our processes that often are it's literally the premise of democracy, and often it's a very underinvested in set of processes, and they operate really lean. I mean, sometimes lean to a degree that I think if people like to all the time view government as wasteful, but I think if you see how lean we ran some of these processes, you'd realize that we need a little more redundancy in those areas. And so we've been working a lot on that, specifically in our elections context, and have some really amazing people who have helped us with that work. I think that in terms of what people should look out for, I mean, we'll be launching that new talent acquisition system in the next few months. It's a big project that we're rolling out, and so excited to see how that goes. I hope it's smooth, but these things are always a little bit bumpier than you anticipate.
Yeah. We'll knock on all the wood and keep our fingers crossed for you. Yeah. All right. Now the hardest question for all of our guests: if you be the GovLove DJ and pick the exit music for this episode, what song would you pick?
Okay. I don't know why this question is so hard. For some reason, the first thing that jumped into my head is Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make the change.
That seems great. Yeah.
Yeah. I think really just focus. I think what I take from that is not just you are the problem, or only focus internally, but really you could only change, you can only eat an elephant one bite at a time, or whatever that ridiculous thing is. You can only start with what's in your control. And if you want to actually make change, I think it really I don't know, has a local government-y cheesy message to me, at least, which is just focus on the things that you can control. Start with what your levers of control are. And that's how you're going to make a difference in the long run.
That's perfect. I love that. That's a great sentiment. We'll get that queued up, and that ends our episode for today. Alex, thanks so much for coming on and talk with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
For our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders, and the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGO member. You can reach us online at elgo.org/GovLove, or at our page on LinkedIn, and subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. If you're already subscribed, go tell a friend, a colleague, a neighbor about this podcast. And a reminder, you can help us celebrate 10 years of telling local government stories here on GovLove by calling our hotline 720-282-1752 and tell us about trends that you've seen in the last 10 years and what you think local government might look like in another 10 years. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
A better place. Take a look at yourself and make a change.